right, if you'll take your Bibles tonight and turn to 1 Samuel 18. 1 Samuel 18, and then if you want to hold your place there and go to James chapter number 3. 1 Samuel 18, drop a bookmark, and then go to James chapter number 3. James chapter number 3. Last week, we left off talking about David and Goliath, right? The story of David and Goliath. And in an instant, David went from being an unknown shepherd boy, the last-born son of a nobody farmer, to being one of the most famous men in Israel and to be a national hero. You know, we already know that God has anointed him to be king. We know that God has promised to take away the kingdom from Saul because of Saul's sin. But there's still like years, decades before David is going to be king. And so we have to find out what happens in the meantime. And what happens in the meantime is that David has to deal with an incredibly dark thing, which is King Saul's jealousy, King Saul's envy. Are you in James chapter 3? I want to read this passage, verses 13 to 18. These are some of my favorite verses in the Bible. I'm reminded of them often. Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. I'm not a life verse kind of guy, but if I had a life verse or a life passage, I would probably sign my name, if somebody ever asked me to, with that passage. It's something I think about very often. How many of you know what an acid test is? You've heard the phrase acid test, but actual acid tests are used to determine if something is gold or not. You know, you can kind of fake something to look like gold. Well, how do we know if it's really gold? Well, they would drop a certain kind of acid on it, and depending how it reacts, they would know this is gold or this is some inferior metal, right? And what that passage in James chapter 3 does is it lays out an acid test for how we can know if somebody is a spiritual, wise person. And I think especially in leadership, if you look at the verse 1 of that chapter, it talks about being not many masters. So not everybody should be a teacher. But if you are a teacher, if you want to know if that teacher actually has spiritual wisdom, if you want to know if there's somebody that has wisdom that's from above, well, this is the acid test. Do they have envy and strife? Or do they have the other things this passage talks about? If you want to be wise, you have to have meekness, humility, pure, gentle spirit. You have to be somebody that others can talk to and bring problems to without overreacting. You have to be merciful. You can't be someone that shows favoritism. You can't be a hypocrite. And then lastly, you have to live in peace. And all those things have an opposite. The negative to those things cannot coexist with the positive, okay? And so the negative of those things that can't come with spiritual wisdom is envy and strife. Envy, wanting what other people have, jealousy, and strife, in this case, is just sort of like a manipulation to get ahead of people, okay? And if you have that in your heart, you have that envy in your heart, you let it live there, and you resort to strife, manipulation, you can be very sure that you do not have spiritual wisdom. So envy and strife are sort of this acid test for being a spiritually wise leader. And I mention that tonight because in our actual text, which you can turn to now, 1 Samuel 18, in our actual text, we're going to look at this story tonight where we see three different leaders. Three different leaders, and all of them have the test. All of them face this test, and some of them shine like gold, and one of them is shown to be earthly, sensual, and devilish. And we'll see that as we go through. I'm going to read the first couple verses first and get one of them out of the way, and then we'll read the rest of the chapter and look at the other two. But look at chapter 18, verses 1 to 4. It says, "And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would not let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle." All right, so what happened here? First leader we're going to apply this acid test to is Jonathan. Jonathan, at this point, is the crown prince of Israel. His father was the king. He's the oldest son of the king. He is in line to be the next king. He's heir to the throne. And we've already seen from previous stories that he is a brave and godly man. He's a strong man. He probably would have made an excellent king. He's a good guy. I challenge you to find something about Jonathan that's negative. He's a good man. And here Jonathan watches this person, David, who he probably had never seen before. Or if he did see him, he was just like a minstrel in the court, a musician in the court. He sees David in an instant become a hero. In an instant become this person that wins this decisive victory for Israel. He defeats Goliath. And in that moment, David is a living legend. Okay? There would never be another time where David was not considered a hero in the eyes of Israel. I was trying to think about this. Forgive the football reference here. But I remember this one Super Bowl the New England Patriots were playing in, where it looked like they were about to lose. It was like the very last second. And I forget what team was playing, but they were throwing, I hope it wasn't your favorite team, okay, but they were throwing, it looked like they were about to throw the touchdown and seal the deal, and the game was going to be over. And out of nowhere, this guy that nobody had ever heard of named Malcolm Butler, who I think was working at a Popeye's Chicken 7 months before that, came out of nowhere and got an interception like the very last second of the game. And I guarantee you, if you go anywhere in New England, Malcolm Butler will always be a hero to those people. He is a living legend. Okay, they were so mad when he was not, when they traded him away, because he was just a living legend. Okay, that David got that status times a million. Okay, because he defeated Goliath in this battle. And so Jonathan sees this, and more importantly, it says he hears what David said. He hears what David said to his father. And David was not a proud man, the way he talked about this, but he was a bold man of faith. And he talked to Saul about God and God's name. And I think that resonated with Jonathan. And I think he realized this guy is coming from the same place that I'm coming from. This guy and I are on the same wavelength spiritually. And, you know, Jonathan was about 5 years older, but they were in the same season of life here. They're both in the court. And here's what Jonathan could have done. Jonathan could have looked at David and seen a threat. Instead, he recognizes David as a brother, as a man in the faith, a brother in the Lord, a man that God had his hands on, and he rejoices in what God had done through David. And our text tells us that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him not as a brother, but as his own soul. Jonathan loved David. Not in some weird way, okay? Don't read that nonsense into the Bible. But they had a bond of instant best friends, closer than brothers. They loved each other as their own soul. And I think Jonathan in that instance made a decision. I am never going to do anything to hurt this man. But he went even further. As he got to know him, he made a covenant with him. And as part of this covenant, he gave him his robe, and he gave him his armor, his girdle, his sword, his bow. Why would he do that? Here's what I think that means. I think Jonathan knew in his heart that God wanted David to be the next king. And I think when Jonathan took off his robe and put it on David and took off his sword and gave it to David and gave him his armor, what he was basically saying is symbolically, I want you to be the crown prince. I'm recognizing that you are the heir apparent. What a selfless act. What a selfless act. He's literally giving the kingdom away. And I think the only way he could have done that was because of the faith that he had in God. It seems like Jonathan knew God well enough to know that God's hand was on David. He knew the Spirit was in this. And rather than be jealous of David as what would be the natural thing to do in that situation, he rejoiced in what God was doing with David. You know, the easiest thing to do and the most human thing to do is to look at other people doing well with envy. We want what they have. God, why didn't you give that to me? God, I'm just as good as him. And Jonathan could have said that. Jonathan was a hero. He could have said, I'm just as good as David. But he trusts God's wisdom. You know, maybe somebody else gets the promotion you wanted. Maybe somebody else is picked to teach the Sunday school class you were hoping to teach. You know, maybe some other mom gets all the recognition. And when that kind of thing happens, our temptation is to run to envy. To be angry at God. And I want to tell you that leads to some dark places, and God is never there. God's never in that. All right? We need to rejoice in what God is doing, even if it isn't with us, and Jonathan shows us that. Now, we're going to look at the next two people in this story, but before we do that, we need to read the rest of the chapter. So we're going to start in verse 5 and read down through verse 27. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass, as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth. And the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, and was departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from him, and made him captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. And Saul said to David, Behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, Let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said unto Saul, Who am I? What is my life, or my father's family in Israel, that I should be the son-in-law of the king? But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel, the Meholathite, to wife. Sorry. And let's just call her Michelle. All right, this is a weird name. And Michelle, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hands of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, Thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in one of the twain. And Saul commanded his servants, saying, Commune with David secretly, and say, Behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spake these words in the ears of David, and David said, Seemeth it to you a light thing to be the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, On this manner spake David. And Saul said, Thus shall ye say to David, The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. Wherefore David arose and went, and he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave him a full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michelle, his daughter, to wife. This is one of those places where we're happy we don't have a pictorial Bible, right? All right, verse number 28. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michelle, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass after they went forth that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so his name was much set by. All right, so a lot of stuff going on in the rest of this chapter. I want to talk about these two other people that get this acid test, right? We're going to see if they're spiritually wise or not. Of course, the first one is King Saul. So we've talked about Jonathan, now we're talking about Saul. Saul at this point has been the king for probably a long time. God has already told him that his kingdom is going to be taken from him. And you know what? A better man would have done at that point is probably step down. Right? But Saul held on. He tried to hold on to the kingdom in his flesh. And so when David came around, and David was suddenly the hero of Israel, Saul did not take it well. He was filled with envy. And we see the source of Saul's envy in verse number 6. After David killed Goliath, the number one ditty on the airwaves, right? The number one song on the radio was this little song called Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And Saul was filled with insane jealousy. And he eyes David from that day forward. Saul could not handle David being more popular than he was. I think everyone could see that God's hand was on David, and most everyone was rejoicing in that, but Saul couldn't handle it. And I actually think that Saul tried to kill David 5 different ways in this chapter, 5 different times in this chapter. The first time he tried to kill him with the javelin. David, even though he's now a famous war hero, he's called in to play for Saul to calm him down when he gets in this mood. And Saul takes advantage of that to try to throw a spear, a javelin, at David. And he throws this javelin at him. He narrowly misses David, and David just runs away. Now, the most interesting thing about that story is what the end of verse 11 says. What's the last verse in verse 11? Last word in verse 11. Twice. So Saul does this 2 times. And 2 times David runs away. 2 times, get this, Saul is trying to kill David with a javelin. And David just runs away. So that's 2 times that Saul tried to kill David. The third time, I think, is starting in verse 13. Saul elevates David to this military leadership role. And he says, I don't have to kill him. Let the Philistines do it. Right? That's his mentality. So he puts David out of sight. He puts him on the front lines. I think he does something similar to what David did to Uriah. I'm just going to put him there and let the bad guys kill him. But David was too good for that. Then Saul tries something a little more subtle in verses 17 and 18. David had been promised, remember when he killed Goliath, he'd been promised that he would have the king's daughter's hand in marriage. That was part of the reward. And Saul brought him in and introduced his oldest daughter, Merab, and he said, I'm gonna give her to you to wife. You're gonna marry Merab. You just keep on fighting. You're gonna marry Merab. And then when the season of the wedding, like wedding day, Saul takes Merab and marries her off to some guy named Adriel. Who's that guy? I don't know. Here's what I think Saul was doing. I think Saul was trying to provoke an unwise reaction from David. Because if David responded to this in righteous anger, Saul could have said, well, that's treason, and had David killed. So I count this as the 4th way that Saul tried to kill David. The final way was he had another tactic. He had this daughter, Mitchell, or Michael, or we'll just call her Michelle, okay, because it feels weird to call a lady Michael. Michelle, Saul knew, was going to be a problem, right? She was a problem. Some of you that have daughters or have had daughters, you ever in your private moments talk with your spouse and be like, yeah, whoever marries her, whoever marries her is going to have fun, right? Molly, we're not talking about you, okay? I think Saul knew that Michelle was not going to be a good wife. And by the way, she wasn't. You'll learn about that later. She was not a good wife for David. She caused problems. I read a book once about Jonathan Edwards, a famous preacher in the Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards had a lot of kids, a lot of daughters, and a lot of apprentices came and studied under Jonathan Edwards and then ended up marrying his daughters. I guess that was the way it was done back then. And he had one apprentice that fell in love with one of his daughters, and he went to Edwards and he said, I want to marry, let's just call her Susie. I want to marry Susie. Okay, and Edwards said, no, you can't do it. And he said, why? Is there something wrong with me? And Edwards said, no, there's something wrong with her. You can't do it. She's not going to be a pastor's wife. She's got, basically, he said in 1700s language, she's got serious issues, man. And this guy was this love-struck poor young man. He said, but isn't she a Christian? Doesn't she have the Holy Spirit inside of her? And Jonathan Edwards said, yes, but the Holy Spirit can live with some people that no one else can. And I think Mitchell was one of those girls. She was just a lot. But David loved her. She loved David. And Saul decided to use this another way to get rid of David. So he had his spies, his little men, plant this little seed in David's ear because he knew what David would do with it. Basically, he said, King Saul's not going to ask for a dowry. In those days, everybody asked for a dowry. Okay, you had to pay for your wife. All right? We could get into that, but we're not going to. Another time. And as the princess, her dowry would have been quite high, and David is a poor man. He can't do it. And so Saul says, David, we're not going to ask for dowry. All I'm going to ask you to do is get 100 foreskins of 100 dead Philistines. It's like saying, you want my car? Oh, I'm not going to take any money for my car. You just have to by yourself kill 100 people and bring me parts of their body to prove it, and then you can have my car. Okay? Just do this thing that you're almost certainly going to die doing. This incredibly dangerous and stupid thing. And if you do that, then you can have my daughter. Not only would David have to fight 100 Philistines in battle, and each one of them would have a very strong vested interest in killing David, but he would desecrate their bodies after he won, enraging their families forever against David, putting a target on his head. And so Saul tried all kinds of ways to get rid of David. By the way, David goes and gets 200. It's love right there. All right, anyways. He tries all kinds of ways to get rid of David because he was envious. His envy turned to manipulation, turned to malice, and he's trying to get David killed. Again, James 3:16 says, "For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work." I want to remind you something here. Whenever you get envious of somebody else, whenever you start looking at another brother or sister as an enemy, and you start entertaining ways to take them down, you are not in that moment acting in the Spirit. God is not in that, ever. Okay? And when you go down that road, you are opening the door for all kinds of wickedness. Who would have ever thought that Saul seemed pretty good, didn't he? Humble. The Spirit came on him and he prophesied. He seemed pretty good. Who would have ever thought that he would stoop to attempted murder? Murder of a loyal subject. Just because of jealousy and envy, but he did. So be on the lookout in your heart for envy. Because if you entertain that, you're going down a dark road that God's not on. All right? Let's look at the last character. Of course, the last character in this story, we've talked about Jonathan, we've talked about Saul. The last character is David. And David in this story does nothing wrong besides follow God and be the passive recipient of all these different things that happen. Think about it. He kills Goliath in an act of faith. Jonathan is so impressed by his faith that he symbolically gives him his robe, gives him this heirship. I don't think David asked for that. It's going to be years before David was king. Things were going to get much worse for David before they got better. Then Saul asks him to play music for him. Here, look. David could have said, you know what? I'm a big deal. David and Goliath, I'm that guy, right? I'm the subject of the #1 song on WISL. Okay? I'm not your minstrel anymore, Saul. Go find some other chump to play the guitar for you. But he didn't. He stayed humble. He did it as he was before. He wasn't too big for that work. I think one of David's biggest tests was his popularity. Many people are not undone by hardship. They are undone by success and popularity. You know, a lot of young people make it big and become famous and burn out in flames, right? They die of a drug overdose, or they're caught up in some terrible scandal, or they end up in prison, or they end up homeless because they couldn't handle the success. And this is a real test for David and his spirituality, to go from a shepherd boy that nobody had ever heard of to the most popular man in Israel. And he handled it very well. He stays humble. Then Saul tries to kill him, throws a javelin at him. Let me ask you something. If somebody throws a spear at you and misses, do you know what that means? That means there's a spear right there you can throw back. And David could have thrown it back. You know, maybe not the first time, maybe the second time. And everybody would be like, okay, yeah, he was a good guy. He let it go the first time. And then he threw the javelin back the second time, and it was just self-defense. But both times, David just runs away. This great little book called A Tale of Three Kings by Gene Edwards. If you ever get a hold of that, you should read it. And it talks about, among other people, David and Saul. But he says this in the book about this situation with David. He says, you know, in doing this small feat of returning thrown spears, you'll prove many things. You're courageous. You stand up for the right. You boldly stand against the wrong. You're tough and can't be pushed around. You'll not stand for injustice or unfair treatment. You're a defender of the faith, the keeper of the flame, detector of all heresy. You will not be wronged. All these attributes then combine to prove that you are also obviously a candidate for kingship. Perhaps you are the Lord's anointed after the order of King Saul. See, the point of the book is David had the opportunity to be just like Saul. And by God's grace, he wasn't. Many of us would justify retaliating against Saul, but then David would just be like King Saul. Instead, David was meant to be like King Jesus. And Jesus, when he was acted against unfairly, what did Jesus do? Jesus prayed, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus went to the cross for his enemies. So then Saul tries to get David with guile, with manipulation. David almost seems simple in this chapter. Like, Saul's doing all these things to kill him. And David, he seems almost kind of like a bumpkin, like, oh, this is great. Like, he doesn't even see it. And you know what? When you're walking with the Lord sometimes and your mind is just faithfully following the Lord, and there are manipulative people around you, you know, God protects you from them, but often you don't even see that they're being manipulative because your heart is simple, not complicated. David's just following God. A summary of David's whole actions in this chapter is found in verse 14, where it says, and David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. David had spiritual wisdom. He had the spiritual wisdom that James talks about. He wasn't playing manipulative games. His life was simple. He was following the Lord. He was obeying the Lord. He was living in the will of God. He wasn't worried about how this was going to look or that was going to look or how this scenario would cause this thing or this person would do this thing. He wasn't worried about that. David just keeps on following the Lord, obeying God. God prospers him. God protects him. Let me read these verses in James one more time and then we'll close, all right? The wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. Envy turns something that was never intended to be a hurt towards you into a hurt towards you. You understand that? David had no hard feelings against Saul. All right? The only thing David did was kill Goliath. Spiritual wisdom is it's important. Do you have spiritual wisdom or do you have envy? Are you a manipulator or are you trusting God? They don't go together. I think we need to be like David was in this story, which ultimately is like Jesus. Let's let the Lord fight our battles and live in the simple peace of God's will. All right? Let's pray. Brother Adam, if you'll come and we'll take prayer requests tonight. Heavenly Father,